one thing is essential. To accelerate decisions, you need innovation that fits the mission. We innovate from AI to zero trust. We integrate using open APIs that you control. We automate with smart solutions so warfighters know and act faster. Your mission, accelerated. Tomorrow's challenges, anticipated. Win faster with Booz Allen.
Hello, and welcome to the Emerging Tech Horizons podcast. I'm Arun Serafin, Executive Director of NDIA's Emerging Technologies Institute. Today we're going to talk about the Government Accountability Office, GAO, and its Weapons Systems Annual Assessment, which it's titled this year, DoD is not yet well positioned to field systems with speed. My guest today to help explain this assessment is Shelby Oakley. Thanks for joining us, Shelby.
I appreciate you having me, Arun.
So Shelby is a director in GAO's Contracting and National Security Acquisition Team. She, in that role, oversees their work in looking at DoD acquisition programs, including oversight over individual programs and their implementation of leading acquisition practices. She comes to GAO, she joined GAO in 2001, where she did a lot of work looking at NASA acquisition programs, including the International Space Station and the James Webb Space Telescope. Shelby earned a master's degree in public administration from the University of Pittsburgh, also a bachelor's degree in psychology and sociology from Washington and Jefferson College. I've had the opportunity to work with Shelby during my time on Capitol Hill, and so it's great to be talking to you again about your latest report.
Yeah, I'm glad to be here for sure.
So let's just start with some background. Tell us about your background and how you got to GAO.
Yeah, I mean, I was a typical early 20s kid graduating grad school, trying to figure out what to do. And GAO is an amazing organization, and that it presents the opportunity for folks to explore different subject matters and areas while you're developing the key skill sets that are required for being an analyst. And, you know, I never would have guessed that I would have ended up in this portfolio where I've been looking at major acquisition programs for, 20 plus years now. Across the government, but mainly, as you mentioned, in NASA and now within the Department of Defense. And so it's been a great learning experience, and it's been really wonderful from the perspective of, at GAO, we get to see and do things that not a lot of other organizations get to do because of our access authorities and the broad authority that comes with that. And so it's been a complete pleasure to be a part of this organization.
And for those people in the audience who aren't super familiar with GAO, can you just tell us what it is? What are its products?
Yeah, GAO is an independent agency. We are nonpartisan, and we work for the Congress writ large. We provide fact-based work to the Congress to support its efforts to make decisions about, policies and funding of the government. And so we take that very, very seriously in terms of making sure that everything that we put in our reports is well supported and well founded based upon evidence. And so we issue reports to Congress. We make recommendations to federal agencies about ways to improve the efficiency and effectiveness of how they go about doing business. We also do make matters to Congress for their consideration, things that can change in law to help the agencies make the necessary improvements that they need. Agencies aren't required to implement our recommendations, but the Congress values our work and often puts pressure on agencies to tell them what they're doing to address the findings of GAO reports.
Yeah, and you and the GAO staff are government employees working in the legislative branch in areas like the Department of Defense activities. You also have people with clearances who can look at classified programs. And the staff is made up of what kinds of people?
Yeah, I mean, I'm glad you mentioned all of those things because that is very important. We have a broad range of staff within GAO because we go wherever the federal dollar is spent. We can go and look at those programs. So, as you might imagine, we have lawyers, scientists, policy analysts like me, we have engineers, physicists, statisticians, economists. So, every discipline that you could imagine is pretty much represented within GAO, and that's how we go about doing our work. Is it's a very collaborative effort where we rely on the collective expertise of folks across our agency to be able to do that. I think one important thing that you mentioned is not only are we government employees, but we're a different organization in a number of ways in that our independence is really promoted by having a comptroller general as our only political appointee in the organization, and he has or they, it's always been a he, but they have a 15-year term, and so that allows us the flexibility and the leeway to be able to report the things that we need to report, even if it might not be the thing that folks in the Congress want to hear.
So let's now get into this report we're talking about. I'm going to hold it up here. GAO prints nice color books that people can get, but your reports are also all available on the GAO.gov website. It's incredibly searchable, and GAO's reports are getting better and better and cooler in terms of graphics and pictures and stuff like that. So this report is the Weapon Systems Annual Assessment. Tell us why you're doing it. Tell us a little bit also about how you do it, the methodology.
Yeah, so this is our 22nd, what you held up as our 22nd annual assessment of weapons programs. This is one of our marquee products that we do within GAO because it's so significant from a government investment perspective. Essentially, we look at every major weapon system acquisition within the Department of Defense and provide a snapshot of performance for those individual systems, but then an assessment of trends across the portfolio of weapon systems within the Department of Defense. This is a $2 trillion investment at a minimum. And so you might imagine that it's pretty useful for members of Congress to be able to have something all in one place to be able to go and say, all right, somebody's coming to talk to me about X weapon system, let me look up and see what GAO is saying about it. And it really provides us with that key tool to support our clients. It also allows us to identify areas where we need to do a deeper dive on a program, and we call those drill downs. And so we'll do drill downs of major acquisition programs, like we have an annual drill down of the Columbia class submarine, the F-35, programs like that are, pretty significant and pretty expensive and require maybe a little bit more of a review. And so we use this product to be able to allow us to say, all right, X program's coming up on some things, that we might want to be taking a look at in greater depth, and it spurs additional work. One thing that it also does is, my team at GAO, we have about 150 staff people looking at this $2 trillion, only a portion of which are looking at this $2 trillion investment. So it allows us to kind of get that broad swath of impact with the limited resources that we have. So to answer your question, I'm sorry to keep going, but to answer your question about how we go about doing the work, this is a very different review than what we do for typical GAO reviews. As I mentioned, the thrust of the review is, these 2-page or 1-page assessments of individual programs. We bring those together by having individual teams of experts who survey the program offices. They send them a questionnaire. They ask them all these questions about what's going on their program. Then they meet with them and they follow up and they get more in depth and then write up their 2-page assessment. We also then take data that's available writ large from many of DoD's data systems that provide, cost, schedule, performance type information. and do our analysis of that data. We get it semi-annually, so we get regular drops of information to be able to conduct that analysis. And those things together allow us to kind of pull together this comprehensive review. While you were on the Hill, Arun, we had an additional requirement added to us, and that was to look at kind of policy and legislative change, policy, organizational, and legislative changes that are occurring within the Department of Defense, and basically like how DoD is implementing them and what changes are occurring. And so each year we also pick an area to focus on in that regard. And as I'm sure we'll probably get to this year, we focused on the software acquisition workforce.
And so you talk about engaging with the DoD program offices, doing interviews, taking some data from them. Do you also engage with the industry side, the performers on some of these contracts?
Yeah, so this is where this product differs from those drill downs that I mentioned. We don't have as much engagement with industry on this review as we do on those drill down reviews. That's just by the nature of, how we do our work. That being said, because we have drill downs on a number of the systems, we do, have kind of those touch points with those folks as well. And we often have more informal communication with industry on this product. On a normal review, for your listeners, it's probably pretty important for your listeners to understand is we have broad access authorities within, the defense industry. And so anywhere where the federal dollar is spent on a government contract, we have access to people, documents, records, anything that we need to be able to do our work. This includes proprietary information. And so we oftentimes collect a lot of information from our industry folks and then use that to meet with them and discuss it and provide their perspective in those reports. It's just that this product isn't that venue where we have as much engagement during the course of the review.
But I guess I would say it's in industry's interest to engage in these kinds of activities when you're looking at programs or how the department is doing better or worse in software or on rapid acquisition. If industry has data and perspectives, the GAO team is in general open to entering into those kinds of dialogues. And industry probably puts everyone in a better place by providing as good information as they possibly can to you and your teams.
Absolutely. I mean, like our intent of our organization is to focus on how to make the Department of Defense more efficient and effective and how it goes about acquiring weapon systems. And industry can provide important perspectives on the things that are challenges for them in making that happen, right? Sometimes we look at decisions that are made or steps that are taken. We're like, that's curious. Why would we do that, right? And when you kind of peel back the onion, you get a better idea of, oh, well, this policy is driving people to make this type of decision, or, the contract says this, and that's leading to these bad outcomes that nobody really intends. And us being able to understand that can allow us to make recommendations for change within the department that can, in some respects, make things easier for industry to engage in those major contracts that they do.
So let's talk about the annual assessment now. What are the major findings that the listeners should walk away with?
Sure. So just for perspective, this assessment is based upon a review of 108 programs. So we cover the broad swath of programs that are the biggest, most expensive programs within the Department of Defense. And now that includes things that are major capability acquisition programs, but also things that are on the middle tier of acquisition pathway, which I'm sure we'll get to. And also things that are future programs. They haven't selected a pathway yet. There's no sense of that going forward. There's no decision about that going forward. And so the analysis that we present in the front end is really based upon all that data that we're collecting about all of those programs. And so, Anybody that's paid any bit of attention to the Department of Defense, over the past several years knows that the words that are the buzzwords and the words that are the keywords to focus on are schedule, innovation, capability provided to the warfighter quickly, right? And so
And
for
cost.
this, what's that?
Cost.
Cost. Well, interestingly,
Okay.
that seems to be less of a concern in what we're hearing from a lot of people. Obviously, it's still completely on GAO's radar, but it seems like what we really want to understand and what the Congress really wants to understand and what DoD is really focused on is like, how can we provide innovative capabilities to the warfighter in a timely manner to meet current and emerging threats, right? And so that's really where we focus a lot of our analysis. And this year, from a schedule perspective, I wish I could say the story was a little better than it is, but it's not. Most programs are still planning on taking 10 plus years to provide capability to the warfighter. In the findings of our report, that doesn't even take into account, as I'm sure a number of your listeners know, some of the recent significant delays that are being reported writ large across the shipbuilding portfolio. So this, I wish I could say it differently, but this is probably going to be an even bleaker story next year from that perspective when we do this again. From a cost perspective, it's the same situation. Costs are increasing. 17.5 billion, which, in the grand scheme of history of cost increases in DoD isn't as huge as it has been in the past, but there's a number of things that lead to it being such a small number. And I'm not going to get into the wonkiness of it, but there's some weird inflation assumptions that DoD got into this year that led to reported cost decreases on certain types of certain programs like KC-46 and Columbia-class submarine, which are reporting huge decreases, but also significant schedule delays. So I think you can kind of see that next year the costs will be something that we'll be reporting on as being a challenge. From a software and cyber perspective, that's one of the key areas that we cover every year as well too, is how are programs implementing modern software approaches and key cybersecurity practices. And we continue to find that even though most of the programs, about 45, are saying that they're implementing modern approaches, they're not really implementing the practices that would show you a modern approach, like using a software factory or delivering a minimum viable product with frequency, incorporating feedback from end users, those kinds of things. And then with regard to cybersecurity, we're finding that the majority of the programs, even though they're planning the key cybersecurity assessments, they're not doing them at the right time to be able to affect the design of the system, so that we can kind of build in that safety and protection from the very beginning. And then lastly, one of our major findings is related to that software workforce that I mentioned. We've been for years reporting that programs have been challenged with identifying and obtaining and retaining the workforce necessary to be able to oversee software development. And that's been a complete challenge that has repeated this year within our programs. And one of the big things that the Congress did to be able to get DoD to focus on how to improve software development department-wide was the direction of developing what's called a software cadre to be able to provide guidance and expertise across the department. This is something that that the Congress sees as pretty important to be able to kind of improve those practices writ large. Unfortunately, what we found is that the software cadre currently consists of one federal employee with a few, some limited assistance from some contractors to be able to do that. And so it just hasn't been built up to the extent I think that the Congress intended. And we made some recommendations about, rectifying that situation and be able to make some of those changes writ large.
So one of the new policy innovations that try to go after some of these speed issues that you're talking about was one that was worked on the Hill a few years ago called middle tier acquisition. And you spend a lot of time in the report looking at some of the programs that are making use of that middle tier acquisition pathway. So let's start by just remind us all what middle tier acquisition, or MTA, actually is.
Yeah, so the MTA pathway in short terms is the pathway for speed, right? It consists of a rapid prototyping or rapid fielding approach. And, for example, the rapid prototyping pathway was intended for programs that can field a prototype that meets requirements and can be demonstrated in an operational environment and provided residual capability within 5 years. For rapid fielding, it's the same kind of urgency, but this is more for proven technologies that can be ready to be fielded with minimal development. And the objective of that pathway is to begin production within 6 months of starting on the pathway and complete fielding, not just start fielding, complete fielding within 5 years. And so that's that's kind of what writ large the pathway is intended to do.
Yeah, and when I was on the Hill when we started to work on this and legislated it the first time, and part of the thinking was, well, we've got these rapid acquisition, rapid fielding programs that can get things done in, let's say, less than 2 years, if they're really mature. And then we have the very traditional path, which, like you said, is going to take sometimes decades or more to get a big capability out there. But there was nothing in between that kind of matched what was thought of both on the Pentagon and the Hill side as the current pace at which technology can be developed and theoretically deployed. Mm-hmm. So it's legislated, it's now running. You've looked at it. What are your findings about how DoD is doing with the authority? I guess from a person who was around at the time, should I feel like it is working or not really working?
Yeah, so I hate to answer the question working or not working because the reason is that we look at the biggest programs, right? Like we look at the most expensive, most complex programs that are using that pathway. And there can be some question raised about whether or not that was appropriate given what those programs were intending to do. But what I would say is that what we've found is the pathway is enabling programs to get started faster. It sure is, right? There's less requirements. It's just a different kind of approach than the major capability pathway. What we aren't seeing is it enabling programs to finish faster. And I think that is where the biggest finding is. What essentially we're seeing is DoD is taking the same kinds of programs and the same kinds of linear, programmatic, long-term approaches, throwing it on a new pathway and hoping to achieve a better outcome. And that's just not going to be successful. What we really focus on is pushing DoD and pushing DoD to think about what is the different approach that you can take? And you mentioned at the beginning our leading practices work that we focus on. How do commercial companies go about fielding innovative products with speed? And what are the approaches that they use? And so we really see the DoD and having an opportunity, especially within the middle tier of acquisition pathway, to be able to apply more of these iterative cycles of design, development, validation, user feedback to be able to field the most meaningful capability in the shortest time possible, with the notion that you will continue to work on that capability and continue to innovate and insert technology as it becomes available. We're just not seeing that. And so some of the programs that we review, we identify some bright spots where they are doing some things a little bit different, like using digital tools, like using user feedback throughout the process, but we're not seeing kind of a writ large change in approach for how they go about acquisition to indeed achieve that speed.
Yeah, and when you talk about this idea of developing minimal viable products, pushing out and off-ramping capabilities as they work, that sounds very much like agile software development. But you're saying it could also be used for cyber physical systems. Um, is that a proven methodology on, let's say, the commercial side?
Absolutely. The companies that we meet, this is how they do business. We specifically go out and we're specifically looking at leading edge companies that develop these cyber physical products that we're talking about. And just for your listeners to be aware of how we're defining that, traditionally you would have hardware systems that have software capability provided, right? These are really software enabled systems that allow the hardware comes in and allows the function of the software to occur. And so that capability of having software really driving the train allows for these iterative cycles of design and development. And so I think that, we have to kind of take a step back and think about, like, we're in a different space in terms of the types of products that the Department of Defense is developing and where the capability is stemming from. It's not stemming from the hardware, it's stemming from the software. And so, of course, practices that are successful in that kind of agile software development realm are going to be similar and applicable to these types of systems. When you look at our work, there's a lot of things that underpin being able to do this type of thing. So when you're in a software development type of environment, you don't, there's nothing to touch and feel and that kind of thing, right? But and so people are always like, well, how can you do this with hardware? How can you kind of like iterate on it and do that kind of thing? And that's where the digital tools come into play, to be able to provide that capability to test as much as you can, design as much as you can, run 1,000 iterations of something in your digital twin to be able to understand, is this going to work, and what kind of capability we can provide in a much shorter time frame, so that you can get to production more quickly and get something out there, all while you're feeding data back into that model to be able to then make continual upgrades, insert any technology or innovation that happens, over the course of that time period.
And I give the Department of Defense credit in that, for example, the Air Force has a digital transformation initiative. There's been digital engineering activities coming out of the Undersecretary for Research and Engineering, Heidi Shu's office, and her predecessor. Our member companies at NDIA, ranging from those guys who do microelectronics designs to do full-up systems of systems, are continually talking about this need for the digital thread and
Mm-hmm.
thinking about digital engineering principles from beginning to end. Like you said, it seems to be commercial best practice to think about both of the things you mentioned, minimal viable product and this digital based iterative design.
Mm-hmm.
So why doesn't it happen? Who's actually, or what is actually against this?
Yeah, I mean, I think the way that we see it is trying to do this on a program by program basis from the ground up is probably not going to be successful. This is going to require an enterprise-wide investment from the Department of Defense to be able to perpetuate these tools and capabilities throughout the organization, and also to perpetuate the understanding of why this is important, right? How we can use them. I think, a lot of things, a lot of people that we talk to can really understand and grasp how a digital twin could be useful in the production environment, right? It seems like that's an easier thing for people to understand. I think what they're not understanding is kind of having it from the beginning all the way through the life cycle of a program and the value that can provide. And I think that's where leadership in DoD and leadership within the services needs to begin to like pilot these types of approaches, share those lessons learned, provide the capability to programs, because maybe a Columbia class submarine program could afford these tools. It's a $130 billion program, right? But a smaller MDAP or a smaller NTA might be reticent to say, oh, I need to make this huge investment in these digital tools to be able to kind of achieve my longer term goals that me as a program manager, I'm not even going to be around to see the outcomes of. And so this is why I think that this kind of digital transformation within the Department of Defense needs to begin at the top and begin to push down into the services with really targeted investments that are outside of an individual program's budget, but that those individual programs can leverage to be able to make progress in this regard.
Yeah, I guess there's an element of one creating digital infrastructure, right? Places
Mm-hmm.
to collect and
Mm-hmm.
store data and providing access to the appropriate people. There's an element of policy as well, right? Ranging from intellectual property issues,
Mm-hmm.
sharing between, let's say, prime contractors and
Yeah.
subcontractors. Um, and then there's also this idea that it's a pretty siloed system. The R&D people sometimes don't talk to the prototyping people, sometimes talking to the not talking to the production people or the sustainment people.
Right.
But that data is useful,
Yeah.
handed up and down the chain. We just don't have the culture in place or the people in place to do that.
Yeah, and when you have those tools, so you just hit the nail on the head, right? With all of those stakeholders across the realm from, cradle to grave of an acquisition program, that digital thread that would be developed for that system would be available to everybody, right? To be able to see, weigh in on that kind of thing. And there are challenges with that, which you rightly identified. But I think that is one way to be able to have people understand the value of this is that it can break down those silos in a way that enables real-time feedback and understanding of what's going on in a program and a real-time understanding of what the long-term implications are of certain design decisions, all along the way. And one thing I think probably for your listeners that's important to mention is that I think the department can do a better job of incentivizing its contractors to make these investments in these types of tools for themselves. Because I think we see varying degrees of implementation at the prime contractor level within the defense industrial base of these things, and oftentimes it's why do they need to make the investments? They have the contracts anyway. And so I think there needs to be a real consideration of how do we kind of get the industrial base to respond to these things like, we're serious, we really need these tools, here's how we're going to incentivize you to make these investments as X company, to be more efficient and effective.
So I want to circle back to the other sort of best practice, this idea of minimal viable products.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm curious how you think that interacts with, one, the requirements process, and second, the budgeting machine, and whether or not we really are set up to realistically get MVPs, minimal viable products, delivered.
No, we're not set up to do that. I think that that's part of, at the beginning of the conversation where I was talking a little bit about, how we need to kind of change the approach writ large. And so, everybody will point to the budgeting process as like the biggest problem, this, that, and the other thing. But even if tomorrow the budgeting process changed and it was more flexible and allowed for,
And
more
they
agility.
took up all the brilliant recommendations of the PPBE
Sure.
Commission.
Yes, absolutely. I don't think you'd see immediate change. And I think that's because, when we talk about the acquisition approach and the long, linear, sequential, milestone driven approaches that have been the history of the Department of Defense and frankly, pretty much every government agency, it's just not situated for being agile and responsive to change or technology innovation. And so I think when you kind of think about the three stools, right, like funding, requirements, and technology, you're trying to think about, changes have to be made in all three of them to be able to achieve kind of ultimate effectiveness. And so what we're focused on in this product is that kind of acquisition approach. Can programs be structured differently to be able to do these iterative cycles of design and development, to be able to respond to those, technology innovations or changes in user needs along the way, right? Then you kind of layer on, can they then get the funding to be able to do that? And then how does the requirements process need to change to be more reflective of what we see in leading companies? In leading companies, what we see is they don't set out to do X and that's it, and they've determined from get-go that this is what they're doing. What they do is they do a little work. They innovate, they iterate and try and understand what can they do in an acceptable time frame that meets the minimum, user needs, and how do they kind of go about doing that, right? And then they kind of chase that. So instead of kind of setting these high level requirements that are set in stone and never move and chasing them for 10 plus years, they do work, set the minimum requirements with a longer term plan in mind, of course, but set the minimum requirements, get that capability out quick. And that capability provision, that minimum viable capability that's provided, is the starting point. It's not the ending point. It's the starting point for us to go right back into those innovation loops and iteration loops and get the next thing out there in that quick time frame. And that allows you to be able to say, oh, wait, it's a year later. Now there's something going on somewhere in the world that we need to respond to. Maybe this isn't the next capability we need to do. Maybe something else is, and make those changes along the way.
And do you think that another element of the acquisition process, the testing process, which is very important because we want things delivered that are operationally effective and suitable for use, can that also be fit into this theory of iterative design and MVPs?
Yes, for sure. And I wish I had the answer as to how that could look now. We have work ongoing right now that's looking at that issue exactly, and trying to figure out, what does that mean? What does kind of this approach mean for the testing world, and how do we kind of gain confidence earlier to be able to, shorten that time frame and ensure we're giving high quality products to the sailors to be able to use. And so stay tuned for that. Hopefully next year we'll get that report out where we're examining that. We're really trying to hit this issue from all facets. And so, we have a requirements job coming up. We're looking at portfolio management and how that works within companies writ large, but then also within the DoD. We have some work looking at testing, as I mentioned, and a few other areas where we're trying to really complete the puzzle of all the, various different facets. Contracting, I mean, that's another area where it's like, how do you even contract for an iterative development and figure out how to do that? And that's one area that's, I think, going to be a little challenging for us, because companies don't have to deal with contracts as much as like commercial companies don't have to deal with contracts as much as the department does. And so figuring out how to be able to be agile in our contracting approaches and practices to be able to enable some of these types of approaches. So it's a work in progress for GAO as a body of work, but we're really excited about it because we think it could bring meaningful change. And one thing I would say is we've met with the service acquisition executives across DoD, as well as folks in ANS, and shared with them, the same things that I'm talking to you about. And unresoundingly, there is support for, making these kinds of changes. And I think, unlike maybe perceptions in a lot of other areas about GAO work, I really see this as kind of an area of, working together and supporting kind of this moving in this direction going forward. And GAO will continue to do that through our work and through our recommendations to the department and continued engagement in that way.
Yeah, and we're running out of time, so we have to wrap up. But just to hit on that point, There is. This is a document that gets printed. I was holding it in my hand. It's right here. Uh, and but in some sense it's a living document, right? You're
Yeah.
continually engaging your staff with the programs, your staff with the higher level people, the service acquisition executives in the department, your staff with the Hill and industry, and you're tracking these programs and these policies on a continuing basis. And in many cases, this kind of engagement is very constructive between
Yes.
you, the executive branch, the industry groups, to make try to get serve the two major customers, taxpayer and warfighter, and
Right.
get things out to them as fast and effectively as possible. And so, yeah, occasionally everyone gets scared when GAO comes around, and they should. But in a case like this could be a very positive, constructive engagement and help everyone be positioned for better partnerships and better delivery.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, ultimately, you said it exactly right. We want to serve the warfighter and the taxpayer, right? And we want to make sure that they have what they need when they need it, to be able to do their job. And so that's the ultimate goal. And if we can have any role and driving the change that helps that happen better, we'll have accomplished, I think, a lot.
So, with that, I'm going to say thanks to everyone for listening to this episode. I'm urging you all to visit ETI and NDIA's website to sign up for our mailing list, register for our various webinars, events, conferences, and educational offerings, including our monthly Tech 101 series, where we've had numerous GAO speakers help us out with that Tech 101 series. If you've enjoyed this podcast, don't forget to please hit the like button and subscribe and leave reviews. Also, we're open to ideas for future podcast episodes. Special thanks to Melanie Yu and Daniel Park for producing this episode. Thanks, everyone, for tuning in to Emerging Tech Horizons. Thank you again, Shelby, for joining us today.
You're welcome. It was a great conversation.